Hello and welcome to TJ's Garden. So the last few episodes I've kind of come back with, I've been doing things as I've been doing them in my garden. So I did a seed starting episode in December because I was starting seeds. Then I kicked off January by talking about stepping up your seeds, things like that. It's all been kind of as I've gone, but there's nothing to do right yet. It's a little chilly to put my plants out, so I'm not going to talk about fertilizer just yet. So I figured I would talk about a topic that kind of pervades gardening, compost. Whenever I'm talking to somebody new to gardening and they're kind of wondering what the trick is or whatever, I point out that there are no tricks, but one of the more basic things is make or find good compost. And then, of course, the question is, what's good compost? So I thought I'd do an episode to kind of just cover that whole topic. It's going to be an overview. I will probably get into some specifics in future episodes, but this should give you what compost is, why we use it, how different varieties of it can be used. There is a little bit of variation, and kind of what stuff people say about compost that I don't really personally buy. So let's get started. I thought I would define compost first because the term gets used for a lot of different things. But I went with Merriam-Webster, and then I have kind of my own home-brewed definition that I use. So Merriam-Webster's is a mixture that consists largely of decayed organic matter, and it's used for fertilizing and conditioning land. Then it has mixture, compound, yada, yada. And then as a verb, it gives you to convert a material such as plant debris to compost. So compost, the verb, just means to create compost, the noun. My definition is compost is biological material broken down by organisms in a controlled environment. And the reason for the precision in mine is I don't consider leaves rotting in a forest to be composting. They are distinctly different things, but they are undergoing the same process. So in composting, we utilize decay. We utilize organisms that break down plant matter, organisms that exist in the environment. In fact, you don't ever really need to add anything to compost to make it work. There are inoculants you can buy, but they largely aren't necessary unless you're working in a somewhat sterile environment or you have had bad issues with compost before, which could mean you have pathogens that you don't necessarily want to introduce into your compost pile. But broadly speaking, the fungi, the thermophilic bacteria, all those things, they're all in your environment, right? All the bugs, everything else you need to make compost exist in the world around you constantly. They're just waiting for an environment they can grow in. In nature, different levels of material rotting and decaying in different ways feeds these things. In composting, we create an artificial environment that is very open to these organisms to get them going. And so what happens is you pile up a bunch of organic matter, and then it becomes gradually inoculated with all these organisms. Worms may work their way into it, small insects. If you're squeamish, this may be a problem since one of the better actual bugs to assist you in composting is a species of cockroach, those brown guys that you never really see in your house, but you see out in your garden. Sometimes they're also found in mulch. They will eat and break down the material in your compost pile. So moving your compost pile and seeing a bunch of little brownish red roaches moving around, not actually that bad a thing. Wood lice and other kind of roly-poly type bugs, those also are decomposers, so they'll help break down material as well. There are going to be loads of different regional bugs, depending on where you are in the world, that'll help in addition to those. But the big movers and shakers in this are sort of going to be microscopic. It's going to be bacteria, bacterial colonies, and fungal colonies. And we'll get into the specifics of different kinds of compost, but basically the initial wave of them will be the small insects and various decomposers. These are things that are going to break materials down. As these things start working, the thermophilic bacteria start getting in there, and they will actually make the compost hot. If you have a aerobic, that is to say an environment where there's plenty of air mixed up in there, and it's not too dense, it's not too wet, but it's moist and it stays that way, these bacteria will start breaking things down on a chemical level, and they will start heating up the pile. It's a bit like fermenting alcohol at this point, right? Because in alcohol, you have yeast, which get in there and they start breaking down sugars and making alcohols, but eventually they top out. Because it's an artificial environment, you've created a habitat where these things can overwhelm themselves and kill themselves. And so in alcohol, they produce enough alcohol that eventually the majority of yeast dies off. And in a compost heap, you're creating this big, heavy, large mound of aerated material that would not really likely exist in nature. And so these bacteria can go to town and start really breaking it down heavily and rapidly. And this is what we call a hot compost pile. And they can get 100 to 4 or so degrees. They can get really hot for quite a while. And the benefit of this is because of that high heat, most of your pathogens, weed seeds, other things will actually break down at these heats. So keeping it at about 104 or so through the hot composting phase eventually kills the bacteria, but it also kills most everything else. And then when the compost gets out of that phase, then mostly fungus actually, different types of fungi and mold actually move in and start doing kind of the final composting. So after the hot composting phase, your compost looks mostly not done. Like there'll be a lot of large material, a lot of things which still look fairly solid, but their structure is broken down. If you actually start moving things around, things start falling kind of apart. But the final wave of fungi, that's what really turns this stuff from, broken down stems and leaves into the black compost that you eventually use. And anywhere in that process, you can kind of stop and use it. What you're going to get is you're going to get a partially finished compost that provides basically mulch and compost, depending upon how much large material is still left. People often do mulch with compost, especially if you're doing a no-dig method, in which case you're just resupplying compost each year over the top of your existing material. So partially finished compost will give you that larger material, which takes longer to break down. But that's the gist of how you make compost in general. Now, there are many, many different kind of specific applications. So generally, if you're using a mix of garden waste, yard waste, kitchen waste, maybe some paper materials, things like that, kind of a mixed pile, and you're going for that 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means about 30%, or I'm sorry, about 30 parts kind of solid dry material to 1 part soft green squishy stuff, like grass clippings, things like that, things that are higher in nitrogen. You're going to get a hot compost heap that will produce conventional finished compost. And the bigger your compost heap is, and the more kind of diversity of materials you have, the easier it is to kind of fudge the ratio and still get something that turns out. Because like in a small compost heap, if your ratio is off considerably, there's just not going to be enough nitrogen there to feed things. But in a very large heap, it sort of balances out. And you see a lot of heaps that a municipal compost company, for instance, will do, where they take all the yard waste from everywhere in town and they mix all this material. A lot of it's grass clippings, so a lot of it is going to be nitrogen based, like heavily nitrogen, and not quite so much carbon. But they're going to build these huge windrows that are turned by machine, right? These things can be 10, 20 feet tall in some cases, depending upon your municipality. And at that mass, these things just burn through, right? I've been to a composting facility and they are just steaming the entire time. The workers have to wear safety equipment working around it because you don't want to accidentally get your arm stuck in a pile or something. You could actually injure yourself. And at those masses, the ratios aren't super important. But if you have a small compost heap in your backyard, the smallest you should really go for hot compost is about a square yard. You don't want to go much smaller than that because the material just won't really ever reach that hot composting phase. There are some gadgets and things you could use, some little plastic composters. And if you turn them regularly and do some fiddling, you can get those to reach higher temperatures. But if you're just doing a conventional compost heap that you turn occasionally, you're going to want to go with about a square yard of material. And it's relatively easy to make one of these up because you don't need any special materials. You can use fencing, you can use pallets, whatever you have to build just, 4 walls. You're basically just building a box that's open on top and bottom, and you just fill it in. If, like me, you're in a dry climate, you can throw something over the top to help keep some moisture in there. Also, if you're in a very wet climate, it's still a good idea as well to cover it over, just because if you're getting a ton of rain, it can oversaturate the pile. And the one thing you really don't want to happen is you don't want to have enough water moving through a compost heap that what nutrients are in there leach right out. And you also don't want it to become so sodden that it actually causes it to start to become anaerobic, because the bacteria that take place in an anaerobic reaction, those bacteria are going to create really horrible smells. Whenever you've smelled something that's like, just been covered over or whatever, and it's rotting, those really horrible rotten smells, a lot of that's coming from an anaerobic process, not an aerobic process. So there's no air in there. So they're breaking things down and metabolizing things in a radically different way that produces a lot of chemicals and stuff you just don't want to mess with. So if you are in a very, very wet climate, you're going to want to cover that stuff over. Here in Bakersfield, I only cover it to keep the moisture in, not to keep it out. So in the winter, I would never cover a pile, because whatever rain we get, I want to go through it. So, what is compost in your garden, now that we've talked about how to make the basic, and then we'll go into some specifics in a bit. But in your garden, compost is organic matter. That's primarily what it does. You put it in your soil, and the organic matter helps break the soil down into nice clumps. It gives it a better, not so much as a texture, right? The sand, silt, and clay, you're not going to change that. But the structure of the soil, the form that it takes, the way the aggregates sort of form, that will shift if you add enough organic matter. Additionally, the organic matter helps facilitate bacterial, microbial, small insect life, which helps facilitate healthy rhizospheres around the roots of your plants, right? When we were talking about before, the area immediately around the roots of your plant is basically being tended by the plant to induce beneficial bacteria and fungi and everything. And having organic matter in the soil feeds that and helps them do their job better, essentially, and helps make sure they're there as the roots develop when you plant a new seedling, so they don't have to develop those relationships from scratch every single time. So overall, it just promotes a better, healthier soil environment that you're then going to put your plants in. But it isn't providing a ton of nutrition. When it comes to micronutrients, the stuff that you get the least of, that plants don't need a ton of, essentially, those are going to be present in compost generally, to some degree or another. When you're talking about macronutrients, though, that's a mixed bag. And nitrogen, the one you need the most of generally, is often not very present in compost. Usually most of that has leached out or off-gassed. The exception being composted manures, which we'll get into in a minute. But anything that has a lot of nitrogen to start with isn't likely to have a lot to end with. It's not an exception, but one example of this, I guess, is municipal compost is mostly made from lawn clippings, and people radically over-fertilize their lawns. So when you get your compost from a municipal dump, it's actually, like I said, I think I said this in the nitrogen episode too, it's fairly high for compost. It's in the low range for an organic nitrogen source for fertilizer. So it's actually not bad as a fertilizer, but it's only because the amount of nitrogen going into that process is so high that what ends up retained is high enough, right? It's not anything that's going to blow your socks off. It's not an amazing amount of nitrogen. It's not going to completely feed tons of plants. But I mean, if you have fairly modest requirements, it can do most of what you need. I've grown plants on it exclusively before and not really had too much problem. I didn't get amazing yields, but I got pretty good yields. When I was doing school gardens, that's pretty much all we used. I would occasionally supplement with chicken manure or something like that, but mostly it was just municipal compost to the rescue. The downside is, at least out here, because of how dry we get, once that stuff has really broken down and gone through the whole phase, it dries out and becomes hydrophobic. And it is a pain to get it to soak water for the first time to help break that hydrophobia, right? Hydrophobia is when soil or other material in your growth medium dries to such a point that it actually repels water. If you've ever seen the soil outside in like your yard or something, if you've ever had it really, really, really dry and you try and kind of hose it and it doesn't sink in, it just sort of runs off the top, kind of gets that oily look to it. That's when your soil's gotten hydrophobic. Also, if you live in a dry climate like me, you've seen hydrophobia when it first rains and the roads get really slick and kind of oily as all those oils percolate out of the road, but the water doesn't really soak in. And it causes a lot of accidents out here. That's why when you first get rain in very, very dry climates for the first time in the year, you get all these accidents. It's not that we all magically forgot in 1 year completely how to drive in the rain. Our roads are literally more dangerous after a rain for that one first time. So you've experienced hydrophobia at some point, and that's a pain. But I mean, it's relatively cheap. It has more nitrogen than compost usually should, and you can get a ton of it. So it's kind of outweighs the cons for me. Anyway, so we've talked about municipal compost, and we've talked a little bit about general compost. So what other forms of compost are there? Well, if you're using my definition, most composted manures fall in that category. Worm compost, vermicompost, worm castings, that also does. As would the compost made with soldier fly larvae. Now, any of the animal-based compost, anything that's based on basically manure of some kind or bodily waste from an animal, is going to have higher nitrogen than the plant matter in your garden or in a farm or whatever, right? Any of that plant matter is going to have lower nitrogen in general than animal byproducts, because animals tend to concentrate a lot of it because we tend to eat a lot of plants. So because we tend to concentrate it and we tend to produce so much of it, that's why, like I said in my nitrogen episode, societies traditionally used a lot of manure before we came up with other ways to get a hold of nitrogen. And so those composts can act as a fertilizer. And in fact, things like pelletized chicken manure, sheep's manure, things like that are sold as fertilizers. But again, they're not going to be as high as synthetic fertilizers ever. They're just going to be high enough that you can use them and mostly get by. You might have to use a little more of them. So those can be used as a fertilizer, but generally it's about soil texture. Now, the other forms of compost, the kind that you can actually make at home, not counting vermicomposting and soldier fly larvae, which we'll get to in a minute. One is bracken. Bracken is actually a single species of fern that is found all over the world. But I've heard that term used, and I may be using it wrong, but I've heard that term used to refer to any compost made with any fern. And that's because when ferns start to break down, they become this sort of spongy, fibrous material. And they're very handy in places where you would otherwise maybe use a moss. So I've seen people using bracken-based composts mixed with other materials to replace things like peat and coconut coir, because they have similar properties. It's not quite as good, but it can work in some cases. I've seen people growing carnivorous plants and other plants that usually have to have a peat-based mix with a bracken compost and other things-based mix. Another, usually actually more accessible and easier to make one, especially if you live in a suburban environment, is leaf mold. If you can get a hold of leaves, get a hold of as many leaves as you want, make a nice big pile of them, and kind of forget about them for about a year. And the material you're left with is leaf mold. It will be broken down, kind of crumbly, especially if you shred the leaves to begin with. It's actually a really good idea to do that first. But you get leaves that's run through with fungus and molds and other things. And so you get this really soft, kind of squishy, flaky little textured compost that is very good for things like seed starting mixes and even potting mixes in general. It also can kind of be a substitute for some of the properties you see in peat and other material, because it can act like a sponge and kind of hold moisture, but without getting too saturated. The difference is that it can kind of get oversaturated, whereas peat usually won't. So it can reach a point where it stops being quite so free draining and just kind of becomes mucky and a mess. But a lot of that is also determined by how you made the leaf mold. If you shredded your leaves fairly finely, you're not going to have much of a problem with that. If there are a lot of big chunks of leaves, you can have more of a problem because they can form kind of a mat. But generally, even though leaf mold has practically no nutrition whatsoever in it other than the trace minerals, it won't have the macronutrients really to speak of, but it will have micronutrients galore, because that's kind of how plants do it, is they drop their leaves to surround their own roots with leaves. So it breaks down over winter a bit and then starts really breaking down in the spring. And the roots can then feed on those micronutrients to kind of reclaim them. It's not so much that the tree would die if they blew away, but it is a nice little bonus. And that's why you tend to see so much leaf litter around deciduous plants. It's part of the strategy. But when you take the leaves and do it this way, you're sort of exploiting that. And so you can actually create your own leaf mold that is then usable as, like I said, a mix for seedlings and other things that really could use that nice, finely textured, moist, damp material. So leaf mold's really great stuff. There's a whole TED talk on leaf mold, which I will put in the show notes, so you can give that a listen as well. But those are kind of the big kinds. And then when you're talking about animal compost, generally speaking, rotting your own horse or cow manure is kind of big steps for a lot of people. I wouldn't recommend doing it unless you just happen to have an abundant source. You can also just directly manure fields. Most people prefer to work with well-rotted manure because it doesn't smell as bad and it's not as hard to work with, but it also will not have quite as much nitrogen and other materials as the raw, fresh stuff. So I'll leave that up to you guys. I don't mess with that stuff directly myself, but I do use quite a bit of chicken manure. I usually buy composted chicken manure. It's a product you can find at most hardware stores. And then you have vermicomposting, which, worm bins, that sort of thing. There's a lot of different weird products you'll see around vermicomposting, but the vermicompost itself works great. The leachate, there's a little bit of debate on. Some people pointed out that should usually just be disposed of, because even though it will contain some nutrients, it's also going to contain a lot of anaerobic nastiness from the bottom of the tray that you probably don't want to dump on your plants. But some people use it and swear by it. I haven't seen much data to support that. Worm tea, there's a little more data behind it. They've studied it as a foliar spray, and it does seem to have some effectiveness there. It doesn't actually seem to matter if you aerate it or not. There's a lot of debate over aerating it, but when you look at the data, there really isn't a lot of data to say aerating it matters. So unaerated worm tea can be used as a foliar spray, but foliar sprays, and I'm going to get into this more with the fertilizer episode, but foliar sprays in general aren't usually that big of a deal. Like, you don't need them. They use them in agriculture for specific applications, but broadly speaking, what you spray on the leaves kind of stays in and around the leaves. It doesn't move to the rest of the plant like you would hope it would. So you're not really fertilizing the plant. You're just fertilizing the foliage and the material around it. Now, if that material happens to be fruit and you happen to need certain specific nutrients at a given time of the year, then it can be really beneficial. But as a general supplement, you're just sort of covering over the issues with your soil fertility. You're not actually fixing them. So it's not really great for that. But otherwise, using worm manure is very, very good. It actually works really well. It also lets you compost materials you might not want to compost in your bin, such as more kind of diverse range of fruits and vegetable scraps that don't necessarily always work as well in the compost bin. You'll actually get more out of them if you put them in the worm bin than you will if you rot them in the compost. In the compost, they just kind of sort of disappear. And that isn't so much the case in a worm bin. They make better use of the materials. Less of it kind of breaks down and sort of disappears into the ground under it. Some of it does definitely disappear in the form of the leachate, but that's about it. Soldier fly larvae are great because they allow you to compost all those animal-based products that you can't really compost well in other methods, usually because of issues with odor, potential fouling of the compost, and possibly attracting things like, rats and other things that might come for the meat scraps. In a soldier fly bin, that is kind of better taken care of, and the soldier fly larva will eat a wide variety of material. So that's a good thing to look into if you want to get rid of more, finished kind of cooked food scraps and meats and other things. The soldier fly is a better solution for those than just throwing those on your compost bin. That said, like I said earlier, if you have enough mass, it largely doesn't matter. You can do that. Now, to kind of go on the topic of the worm tea, there's also various compost teas. People make compost bioreactors. There was a book, Teaming with Microbes, where it has all kinds of details on how to use a microscope to try and ID the bacteria and stuff to see that it's working, and then using that as a foliar spray or a fertilizer for your soils. And there isn't a lot of actual data behind that stuff. One big thing is that as gardeners, unless you're a microbiologist, using a microscope the way a lot of advocates of this sort of stuff tell you to do is kind of useless, because you are not going to be able to ID successfully the specific species of rotifiers and bacteria and microbes in your soil. And even if you could, the environment you're creating in compost tea or other similar concoctions is not the environment you're dumping that material onto. And so the second those organisms enter that new environment, they're in an environment radically different than where they were cultured, and there's no reason to believe they're going to just continue business as usual. It would be a bit like if you cultured a ton of fish in a tank and then dump them in your backyard and expect to have free roaming fish in your backyard. Unless your backyard is itself a pond, that's not going to work. And so a lot of the various preparations and concoctions and everything else with compost kind of suffer from that same problem. Again, I'm not saying that stuff definitely doesn't work. It's just I have yet to see any data that supports that it does. And it doesn't intuitively make any real sense that it would if you know anything about biology, because putting these organisms in radically new environments would probably just kill them. And for the most part, what you're trying to do with compost is you're not trying to build up soil biology and then introduce it to your soil. You're trying to build up broken down organic matter that is in the perfect state, or as close to it as you can get, for soil life to utilize and build a strong soil web with what you have natively in your soil to begin with. You don't want to introduce new things. You want the things that are there to boost and become stronger. You want the spores in the air all around you, the spores you're breathing in right now, to become active and take root and do their thing. Because we're mostly relying on spores in the air we breathe and bacteria in the ground you're walking on to do the work in all these cases. And you're trying to facilitate that, which is kind of the strongest argument I can make in any of this. Now, again, I'm not a soil microbiologist. I'm a gardener. I do read quite a lot on these subjects, but I am not absolutely the expert. So I will post some links in the show notes to a few articles and stuff that are written by people better versed in these topics than I am. And you can kind of poke around there. I would say this, no matter what resources you get from me or anywhere else, kind of try and follow those through and see what studies are citing, that sort of thing. See where that, don't just read, a news article, figure out what study they're talking about and what the study actually says, so you know kind of what's going on. There's also, at some point in the future, going to be an episode on science for gardeners, talking about digging into studies and figuring out stuff and kind of looking at the fact that the garden industry, separate from farming and agriculture, doesn't have a lot of money put into research. And that's very problematic. We have all these ideas people are putting out there, popular books, everything else. We don't have a lot of research to support any of that stuff. So when you're looking, a lot of times the answer you come up with when you actually look for the research is it's just not there. It's not that the thing is necessarily provably wrong. It's not that there's tons of research that shows that, say, hugelkultur doesn't work. But there isn't any data out there that really says that it does. It's just one guy saying, oh, it worked for me, and passes that on to the next person. And if that person happens to have good results, they say it worked for me. And if it doesn't, they say it didn't work for me. And annoyingly, quite often, we just don't listen to the guy who it didn't work for. We're more interested in how it worked for the other guy. So we keep going with that. It's a problem. But anyway, I hope I've helped dispel some of the myths and given a solid overview for composting. I will probably do future episodes. If I've gotten anything wrong, and you can show me where I've gotten something wrong, by all means, go to tjsgarden.com. I've got my Twitter, my Mastodon, even my email up there, so you can reach out to me and tell me I'm wrong. Just please provide a source so I can look it up and be sure. So go out and reclaim the full value of your labor. This has been TJ's Garden, and I'm its creator, Troy Truchon. And as such, I'm releasing this under a Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International Creative Commons license, meaning that you can share this, alter it, do whatever you want with it, provided you give me credit and you don't deny anybody the right to do the same with any derivative works. You can find the information on that license at the Creative Commons website at creativecommons.org.